The first championship game in NFL history was a mess in more ways than one. It was a mess because the game was played on a surface comprised of bark, dirt, and elephant dung. It was a mess because this was the first indoor game ever organized in NFL history that actually counted. It was a mess because according to league rules at the time, the game shouldn't have even been played. So just how did this mess come to pass? I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is the Touchback, and today we recount the tale of the first championship game in NFL history. Boy, let me tell you, it's about to get all kinds of messy up in here. The NFL did not make a hell of a lot of sense in 1932. Staten Island had a team. The forward pass was more a novelty concept than successful football strategy. And worst of all, 10 games ended in ties that year, although these didn't really count in the standings. I mean, the games were played, the stats were recorded, but the results ultimately didn't matter. This conveniently brings us to why the NFL was playing a championship game in the first place. Prior to this point in time, the league had just determined its champion by whoever had the best regular season winning percentage. Heading into the regular season finale, the Green Bay Packers were by far and away the best side in the competition with a record of 10 wins, 2 losses, and 1 tie. This was the most wins in football for the season by some margin. However, those Packers still found themselves in a must-win game against the Chicago Bears if they were going to be champions. That is because those Bears, despite having only won 5 games up until this point in 1932, would have a higher winning percentage than their rivals due to 6 ties. Since winning percentage was calculated without the ties being any part of the process, a 6-1 record beat a 10-3 record. This, of course, would make Chicago champions and Green Bay runners-up. Well, not exactly, but we'll get to that in a second. The Bears broke a 0-0 deadlock in the fourth quarter and duly won 9-0. Green Bay and their 10 victories, the most in the NFL, would not be champions. There was a catch for the Bears, however. Namely, they had the same exact winning percentage as the Portsmouth Spartans, who finished the year with 6 wins, 1 loss, and 4 ties. Oh yeah, the Bears actually played 2 more games than the Spartans in 1932, and it didn't even matter. When determining the NFL champion, should 2 teams be tied on winning percentage, the tiebreaker then used was head-to-head record. Unfortunately, that proved to be irrelevant because the Bears and Spartans played twice and drew twice. What to do? Co-champions could have been an option, but with America undergoing the Great Depression and the NFL in desperate need to make money, then Bears owner George Halas had himself an idea. A one-off championship game could be an easy way to boost the league's coffers and bring in some much needed extra funds. There was a catch, however. The league needed to quickly rewrite its rulebook to allow for such a game to be played. That was the easy part. Now, everyone had to come together to organize a championship game in less than a week's time. The Spartans quickly agreed to play the game in Chicago because attendance there would be higher than their home city of Portsmouth, Ohio, meaning extra cash for everyone. The weather was not so agreeable. Snow and freezing temperatures threatened to ruin a championship game by scaring away potential attendees. For that clash between the Bears and Packers, only 4,000 or 5,000 or so brave souls were willing to put up with the weather to watch the football game at the then Bears home of Wrigley Field. With the forecast calling for more snow and cold temperatures, Halas had himself another idea. He suggested moving the game indoors to Chicago Stadium. By the way, this is the same Chicago Stadium we're talking about that 60 years later would host the Bulls three-peat. Think about that for a second. Anyway, the Bears had actually played in Chicago Stadium in 1930, but that was a charity contest, and quite frankly, nobody knew what the hell was going on. They sort of just made up the rules as they went. There had also been indoor football games played elsewhere in America, dating back all the way to 1902. It goes without question, there were a significant number of risks involved with doing two first at the very last minute. The plan to play in Chicago Stadium came together with things not being finalized until 2 days before the game was supposed to kick off. That is when local newspapers made an announcement that the indoor game was on. With one mess cleaned up, another one needed tending to. What exactly would the rules and field dimensions be inside Chicago Stadium? It did not have room for a 100-yard field or anything that would basically match what you would see at a regular NFL game. This led to a slapdash of random things, most of which had never been seen before. For starters, Chicago Stadium could only accommodate a 60-yard field and 10-yard end zones, with the field width also being smaller. To accommodate the smaller width, all plays would begin on or inside the hash marks in the middle of the field. Remember, up until this point, the ball was placed sort of wherever. Elsewhere, drop kicks and field goals were banned, so teams wouldn't nerf these to score points. Additionally, there was a stipulation requiring the ball to be moved back 20 yards when a team crossed their opponent's 10-yard line. That was to make it so the field at least seemed a little bit longer. Teams would need to theoretically go on longer drives. In other words, though, this was not going to be your typical game of gridiron football. But it was good enough for the participants, so I mean, why not? The final challenge that needed to be solved before kickoff was what exactly the players were going to be playing on. It's not exactly like huge tracts of green growing grass were readily available in the Chicagoland area during winter. Also, AstroTurf is still some 30-ish years away from being invented. The only solution, it turned out, was going to be a proper mess. The Chicago Stadium floor was concrete, which obviously wasn't going to work. However, the venue did have a bunch of dirt left over from the circus, which had been in town a few days earlier. Calling this dirt, by the way, would be somewhat generous. Yeah, there was dirt mixed in, but there was also a lot of elephant feces, random debris, and quite a bit of garbage as well. No cleanup or screening of the dirt took place because it is dirt after all. The stadium staff just plopped it on the floor, sprinkled a little bark on top of that, painted some lines, and you were ready for some football. If this sounds awful, by the way, it was actually far worse than you could ever imagine. Virginia Hollis McCaskey, who would eventually become Bears owner, was at the game and had this to say in a 2019 interview with the Chicago Tribune when asked about what she remembered about that first championship game. Just the odor. It was almost overwhelming because the circus had just left town. The rules were janky, the field smelled like crap, and no one knew this football game was going to be played indoors until 2 days beforehand. By God, though, these people were going to make it work. The first championship game in NFL history and the first indoor game in NFL history were ready for kickoff. For Portsmouth, though, the game would be kicking off without a key member of their team. Starting quarterback and kicker Dutch Clark had a prior engagement that prevented him from attending. He also happened to be head basketball coach at Colorado College, and the school was unwilling to give him any time off for the game. Since it was impossible for him to foresee a game happening that by rule should have never ever been allowed to take place, the future Pro Football Hall of Famer would miss out. Things didn't go so bad at Colorado College, though. He guided their basketball team to a 14-6 record. So a silver lining, perhaps? Even before things kicked off, the first championship game / first indoor game in NFL history was far more successful than it had any right to be. Chicago Stadium sold out with more than 11,000 people in attendance. That number, by the way, is double the amount who saw them play against the Green Bay Packers at Wrigley Field the previous week. Back in Portsmouth, Ohio, fans paid 25 cents apiece to attend what could best be described as a listening party at a local auditorium. At a time when football was really struggling to build an audience and to connect with the American public as a whole, this was arguably the league's most anticipated moment to date. Unfortunately, the game itself was nothing but a grand mess. And no, we're not just talking about the professional football players rolling around in circus animal feces. The teams didn't really know how to cope with the narrower field, and playing on dirt with some bark sprinkled on top didn't exactly provide the best footing. Punts and kickoffs clanged into the stands behind the end zone, and nothing much really happened during those first 3 quarters, which were scoreless. That, by the way, not a huge surprise given who was involved. The Chicago Bears that year, their first 3 games of the season all ended in 0-0 ties. Thankfully, though, business did pick up in the 4th quarter. Facing a 4th and goal at the 2-yard line, Bronco Nagurski threw what could best be described as a pop pass to Red Grange for the game's first score. The play itself was hugely controversial. The Spartans contended that Nagurski wasn't 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. That, by the way, was required by the NFL rules in 1932. This is something Portsmouth would complain about bitterly in the aftermath of the game, but obviously nothing could be done, no instant replay, nothing of the sort. That being said, though, this was something that Nagurski had been accused of doing all of the time up until this point. Like, it was routinely thought that he was never 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage before throwing a forward pass. Just for whatever reason, the refs would not call this. The Spartans did not have any answer to speak of. In fact, a few minutes later, they would fumble the ball out of their own end zone, that of course being a safety, and the Bears would go on to win their first championship since 1921 by a final score of 9-0. The game itself, it's nothing more than a messy spectacle. Yet that's exactly what the NFL needed at this time. It needed to get a little messy. It needed to get dirty. It needed to throw crap on the wall to see what stuck. And in this case, that crap just happened to be elephant crap. The aftermath, the impact of the first championship game and the first indoor game in NFL history was massive. Firstly, the championship game would become a regular feature of the NFL moving forward. In 1993, the NFL separated into 2 divisions, and the winner of each division would face each other in the championship game. On the downside, the stupid winning percentage formula that removed ties from the equation was still used to determine division winners. And with overtime still decades away, ties were very much a part of the NFL. The way the game was played was dramatically altered in the wake of that first championship game as well. For starters, each play began with the ball placed on or between the hash marks. This became a permanent NFL rule thanks to this first indoor game in league history where it happened. Elsewhere in the rulebook, the forward pass became legal anywhere behind the line of scrimmage, not just 5 yards behind it, because, well, if Bronco Nagurski was going to do it, why not just make it legal anyway? The Portsmouth Spartans would play one last season in Ohio before moving to Detroit and becoming the Lions in 1934. And in 1935, they would win their first NFL championship. As for Dutch Clark, the Portsmouth starting quarterback who didn't actually get to play in that first NFL championship game, the indoor spectacle, well, his story does have a somewhat happy ending as well. Clark didn't play in the NFL during the 1933 season as he wanted to focus on a new job, that being head football coach for the Colorado School of Mines. He did return to the Spartans franchise in 34. Of course, at that time, they had become the Lions, and he did help them win the championship in 35. A few years later, Clark would even go on to become player coach of Detroit. Perhaps the only thing notable to not emerge from the first championship game and the first indoor game in NFL history were more indoor games. As they tend to say, the technology just simply wasn't there. Without venues capable of supporting full-size fields with proper playing surfaces, the idea wasn't really feasible and wouldn't become a reality until decades later. And even then, playing football indoors hasn't really taken off. There's something about the sport that it needs to be outdoors whenever possible. The first championship game in NFL history, it was a mess, literally. But in this case, it was a good mess. It was a much needed mess for the National Football League. It allowed the professional game to get out from under the yoke of college football, which it had struggled to do previously. It would still be some time before the NFL truly captured the attention and the hearts and minds of American sports fans. However, this game featuring a way too short field and grown men running around on elephant turds was definitely the start of that process. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know more about the history of arena football and really all things indoor football in America, well, check out the video in the upper right hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.